when you base your conviction on the coerced testimony of a white felon and ignore the testimony of 24 law-abiding Black witnesses. When any evidence proving his innocence is suppressed and anyone who tries to tell the truth is threatened, this case becomes more than the trial of just a single defendant. It becomes a test of whether we're going to be governed by fear and by anger or by the rule of law. If the people standing in the back of this courtroom are all presumed guilty when accused, if they have to leave here and live in fear of when this very thing will happen to them, if we're just going to accept the system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, then we can't claim to be just. If we say we're committed to equal justice under law, to protecting the rights of every citizen, regardless of wealth, race, or status, then we have to end this nightmare for Walter McMillan and his family. The charges against them have been proven to be a false construction of desperate people, fueled by bigotry and bias, who ignored the truth in exchange for easy solutions, and that's not the law. That's not justice. That's not right. I ask that this case be dismissed immediately, Your Honor. Thank you.
I wish to point you all to the book of Amos. The first verse of Amos places the book during the reign of Jeroboam, king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel's three major enemies, Babylon, Egypt, and Assyria, were not active during this period. And so Israel was able to occupy that void in political space. It caused an economic boom. The power and economic prosperity in the background for Amos's prophetic ministry. Political and economic progress had led to ethical and religious decline. Wealth taking advantage of the poor and the profit motive were the most notable features of the Israelite society. The rich had multiple houses and could furnish them luxuriously. On the other hand, the poor were destitute, oppressed by an unjust and corrupt society and legal system. And so the book of Amos portrays a culture where wealth and wasteful consumption existed side by side with desperate poverty. Religious worship centers were utilized by the people and sacrifices were made, but religion was only a form of godliness. Amos says God hates and despises all these religious forms because they are not accompanied by justice and by righteousness. And so, if I may point you to Amos chapter 5, he says, in the words of God himself, I despise your feast days. I will not smell in your solemn assemblies. Though you offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. He says, take thou away from the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy instruments. And then finally it says, let judgment rain down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. That's the words of the prophet in a society that was torn by racial and social injustice. We at Mississauga Seventh-day Adventist Church want to be very clear about our conviction, from leadership to the very last member, that we stand against inequality, inequity. We stand for justice, for righteousness, and for peace and equal rights for all mankind. This is a platform on which we'd like to face this discussion on this Sabbath afternoon. The topic is necessary conversations, conversations which we need to have. Social justice, race, and the church. We have a team of young people today that are going to be speaking to these issues. I'm going to allow them to go ahead and introduce themselves. We have Derek, Audny, Ray, and Fiona. Who would like to go first? Derek?
I'm just really happy that you called me young pastor and that I could still get away with that. Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Quashie. I'm a member of Mississauga Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm also a lawyer. I practice corporate immigration work where I move executives around the world who are relocating for business reasons. And I've been over the last couple of weeks engaged with my organization and many other organizations around race and social justice, and I look forward to being a part of this dialogue.
Thank you so much, Ray. Ray's a long-standing member of the church. Our church family knows him very well. We thank you for taking the time to come into this discussion. Audny.
Oh, hi friends. My name is Audny Cachet. I'm one of the co-leaders of Acts 29, part of Mississauga's youth ministry. I am a social activist, as one would say. I got involved with activism in the 7th grade in my predominantly white community when I started creating Black History Month assemblies for my school. That transpired into me being very vocal and active all throughout high school as I just graduated from grade 12 this year. Me and my friend Carlene Christian created the Black Student Union and Alliance at our high school at GCVI. And we have created great relationships with our community leaders and political leaders, such as the Guelph Black Heritage Society. They hosted the Guelph protest, Black Lives Matter protest. And I was there, did a little spoken word. I write poetry also. And yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Audney. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for putting yourself out there to be a part of this conversation. Brother Ray, tell us a little about yourself, please. We're not getting from Ray. Ray, you're muted.
I'm muted. Sorry about that. I do apologize. Can you hear me now? Praise the Lord. My name is Ray Bramble. I'm originally from Montreal. I've been a member of the Mississauga Church for a very long time. So I'm really glad that we are having these kind of conversations. During the day, I am a talent manager and a marketer. And it's interesting in the work that I do, the different ways in which race, anti-Black racism, and prejudice come up. So I think it's really important that we are having these conversations just to make the world a better place in general. I think it's also really relevant that we as a church are leaders. We shouldn't be behind the scenes or just praying about these types of things. Yes, I do believe in the power of prayer, but I also do believe that faith without works is dead. And so I'm glad that we are moving forward to help make the world a better place. So I'm very glad to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ray. And our last panelist, Fiona, tell us a little more about yourself, please.
Good evening, everyone. It is such a great opportunity to be with you today to talk on this very important topic, race, social justice, and the church. I am Fiona Edwards. I am a mental health professional. I am also a PhD candidate where I'm conducting research on the mental health of Black youth. My areas of interest are race and racism, religion and spirituality, mental health, and Black youth. I hope today's dialogue will be very informative and helpful to everyone who is listening.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Welcome to our church community. We hope that when we are assembled physically, that you can join us on location.
Thank you for the invite.
No problem, no problem. Okay, so we're gonna get right into this conversation. Towards the end of this conversation, we're inviting you to give in your comments and your questions so that we can pull them into the discussion later on in a little later from now. You can comment on Facebook or comment on YouTube, and we have people that are actually going to be looking at them, grabbing them, so that we can assess and work through them within this space. All right, so race. What would you understand racial prejudice to be? Sister Fiona.
Racial prejudice, from my understanding, is the negative attitude that is projected towards people that are seen as different or racialized. But in order to understand the extent of racial prejudice, I think we have to go back to historical understanding of race. And if we go back to that period of time, we understand that race is a social construction, and Eurocentric norms, they use what is called race science, which is false claim about race, where they use, like, for example, the size of a brain to determine group differences. And what we see, based on experiment that has been done, Black people, like an adult Black man, his brain was seen as being equivalent to a European white child. So by this idea of race, we get to understand that race was something that was biologically constructed. It wasn't based on scientific facts as it was presented under colonialism. And from what we're seeing through that process, they were able to use that construction of race to create white supremacy. And we see that happening under the institution of slavery. Because under slavery, Black people was very much oppressed because of the color of the skin, because of the way they were constructed, because of the way race was understood. And because of that, we end up with what we call racism. And racism is the endorsement of a superior race. And white people are seen as that superior race, and Black people are seen as the inferior race, Black and other racialized group. So from there, because of racism, and a component of racism is stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. And prejudice is basically negative attitude about people of a particular group. And we know as Black people, even in the Black community, the way that we are seen in society, it's less than, it's like we can never measure up. And it is said that because of that, Black people are often conceived as being less intelligent, less capable, can withstand high pain. And all these are perpetuated through European norms, Eurocentric norms that continue to plague Black people and affect us in marginalized ways. So that's how I understand the whole concept of race and how we come to that place of racial prejudice and so forth.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That's very well said. We are still on that topic. What do you understand racial prejudice to be? Anyone else like to speak on that? How do you interpret racial prejudice?
I feel like Fiona said everything.
That's fine. That's fine. Fiona, so you are saying that it's something that's cast down from a place of superiority.
Correct.
So then Ray, if that is the case, would you say, I've heard it said that Black people can't be racist. Would you speak to that, Ray? Would you be willing to share some light on that?
Okay, I'll do my best. So my understanding of racism is that racism requires power. So, you know, in order for one person to be racist against someone else, there has to be some sort of like power system that follows behind it. And so, Black people just simply don't have that kind of power. When you look at history, when you look at 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, you look at Jim Crow laws, you look at all of what has happened after that, and then you yeah, when you consider all of that, like there's literally no way that Black people can be racist. We can be prejudiced, which is the problem. But we can't be racist because we just simply don't collectively possess that kind of power. You know, and when you look at racism and you think about anti-Black racism, it's really deep seated. I live in the region of Peel, and the Peel school board now, they had some sort of an independent report, and the report came out that over the years that there's been evidence of anti-Black racism. So what we're saying, what they're really saying, is that people have been educated and gone through the entire system. I went through 13 years, all the way from kindergarten through to OAC. I'm showing my age by saying that, by the way, all the way through there, and people are being taught year after year, and it's all it's all a part of a system that is not necessarily set up for us to do well or for us to excel. And so without that power to be able to help make that, without that power, it's just prejudice, which is a problem, but it's not racism.
Thank you. I think that casts much light onto the monster that we're dealing with. Because I think Fiona was sharing us with us a psychological or philosophical viewpoint. That you were able to step even further into, in that system that's founded on that philosophical thought, it perpetuates these racial biases.
And if I could just really quickly as well, I think that it's that misunderstanding of the word racism. I think that we've kind of watered. I don't know. I think it might even be intentionally watered down. So that, you teach children, hey, don't be racist, so that everyone thinks, oh, well, I'm not, it's like, no, there's a difference. Like there's a difference. I think it waters down what has happened, and it waters down the effects. So it's like, it's important that people understand that there's a difference. Like violence is different from domestic violence. You know what I'm saying? Like those are two different things, and they need to be addressed. They're both wrong. Please folks, don't be violent. But domestic violence is a separate issue altogether. Just one of them.
But like adding on to your point, so sorry, is that if you see, that's a privilege not to know the difference between what racism and prejudice is, and that shows what the system does, that you can go through 14 years of school and not know the difference between the two.
And right on that point, Audney, I'd actually like for you to speak on how that affects the education system. You've been in a predominantly white community for school, right? How have you seen that affect the education system?
Well, before I moved to a predominantly white school, I grew up in Brampton, not for long, but what I've seen with my friends is that Black girls and boys are targeted more with suspensions, with more discipline. We are seen as aggressive and rude, and that we can't accomplish what other kids can. When I moved to Erin in the 4th grade, I was coming out of French immersion program, and the principal said that I wouldn't fail French immersion. So if you can see, why would I fail French immersion? All throughout elementary school, me and my sister both, we're pretty smart people, and the teachers would mark other kids higher than ours. I remember one time I did an entire science project by myself in a group assignment, and everybody else, my white partners, got higher marks, even though I did it by myself. So like those little things, you can see how unconscious biases and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism is present in the school systems. If you see in Peel District School Board, a school counselor called a predominantly Black school McCriminals, because there's a lot of violence there, but they only put police officers in the school and have not put any other initiatives to reduce the violence or discipline kids in a different way. And principals and teachers don't understand the way these kids express themselves, and it ends up into suspensions. I have suspensions on my record. My friends have a lot of suspensions on their record because we were told that, oh, you just need to this course of discipline is the right way. So anti-Black racism is very present in the Ontario school system. And going on to that is that there's not even any education towards Black history or the presence of Black Canadians and African Canadians in this country. So those little things really impact the way that Black youth grow up in the school system.
Thank you so much for speaking to that, Audney. I'd like to actually segue to Derek. And Derek, I apologize for getting your name wrong before. I didn't even realize. Thank you.
It's okay. You can call me Ray. I like Ray.
Thank you so much for correcting me. But Derek, would you be able to speak to, as someone who's in the corporate world, you know, how this affects a Black person in the corporate world?
Yeah, and I wanted to add, you know, as we defined racism and the system of creating creating a hierarchy as it pertains to color, you know, we defined it, but you know, in the definition, it's important to recognize that how, you know, this hierarchy that's been defined has not only been defined, but has, as a result of perpetuating certain aspects of life, have now often, unfortunately, been embedded in Black people as a belief system about themselves. So it's, you know, to a certain extent, because of years and years of teaching and years of believing this kind of hierarchy and it being taught to us, unfortunately, it has become kind of, you know, an ingrained belief for many of our own people in what we do and the systems that we navigate. And that's disconcerting, right? There's one thing for, you know, white society to create the concept. It's another thing for us to learn it and believe it. And the impact of that is so troubling for us. But we can never believe that these systems do not enter like the workplace the same way they enter the schools and the same way they enter every other part of organizations. And so what we see in the workplace systems are the same things that we see in the school systems, right? There are barriers. There are barriers to progression. There are oftentimes challenges in even finding yourself, who may be a very skilled Black woman or Black man in jobs that you are qualified for, right? Because the person who is reviewing your resume, the person who is a part of the interview, the person who will eventually be your manager or your boss are part of the system, are part of this system of oppression that has been taught to them, whether at home or at school. So we find the same challenges in the corporate space. We find us, you know, fighting for equity and equality and fair treatment the same way, unfortunately, we see in other parts of our lives in society. And so lately, because of the events that have been going on in the US and now globally, it has been pushing the conversation more so in corporate spaces now more than ever before.
Thank you, Derek. I'd like for you to also, you know, consider the justice system. Of course, we live in a racialized society, but we find that people of color are often get the bad end of the justice system. You know, they're treated unfairly within the system. How, as a corporate lawyer, how do you deal with that? Is that true?
Yeah, I think and again, I'm not, I'm not on the, criminal side, and I'm not in the courts. I do more corporate work, but I think I think the numbers are clear. The numbers are clear that, we see much more of our Black youth, our Black men, stuck in the criminal justice system. And we wonder if the system is working for us or working against us. We see more interactions that are negative with the police, who are supposed to serve and protect. But if you're afraid of the authority that is supposed to serve and protect you, there's a problem, right? And that tension continues. And so I think, yes, absolutely. Is there racism in the criminal justice system? Absolutely. And I think that comes from, and there's so many aspects to racism, right? There's conscious and unconscious bias, right? So let's be clear that, what we're talking about is not necessarily people who are explicitly oppressing people as they go through their day-to-day work. There's a lot of implicit microaggressions, unconscious bias that lends itself to Black people being at the short end of the stick when it comes to justice and equal rights. So absolutely, I would say that the system in the judicial system, has certainly is certainly part of the problem, and has been consistent with every other part of society in terms of perpetuating racism in its forms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm gonna throw this question out to everybody. Of course, we live in a society, as Derek was saying, that is charged by race, and whether or not they're explicit or implicit, in your face, or it's subtle. When was the first time that you realized in your own lifetime that you live in a racially charged world, a racially biased world? Was there an encounter? Fiona, yeah?
Okay, I will start. So you know what? I grew up in the Caribbean, predominantly Black. When I was in the Caribbean, I was only Fiona. When I migrated to Canada, I become very conscious that I was a Black person. And that was my first time realizing that race is an issue. And I've had experience that I had experience where I felt that I experienced racism. And as a Black woman, it doesn't matter how much education you have, it doesn't matter how much wealth you have. Society when they see you, they see the color of your skin. And one of a Black scholar named Fiona, he said, like, when people look at you, your skin color is the most outward manifestation of race. And we see that happening in the criminal justice system, because what the law enforcement do is that they lump all Black men as criminal. For example, when they approach a Black man on the street, the first encounter is like, you look like a suspect. You look like somebody we're looking for. So that whole idea of seeing Black people as less than, as criminal, as not belonging, continue to perpetuate racism. And we see systemic racism occurring everywhere. And within the school system, the criminal justice system, child welfare, it's an issue for everybody. And being a Black person, the whole idea of color blindness, not seeing color, I just think it's like it perpetuates racism, because sometimes, so many times, even in my like, oh, I don't see color. But when you look at somebody, you don't see their heart before you see color. You see color first. And being a Black person, it doesn't matter what your social location is within the context of your race. At certain point in your life, you will experience some form of racism.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fiona. Anybody else wanting to speak to that? When was your first encounter with overt racism?
I'll speak on that. Well, like, when I moved to White Town, I always knew I was Black because I had very nappy hair and I looked different from everyone. So it came to me very early. But the first time that I experienced explicit racism, I've told a story many times, but it was in 7th grade. I was with a group of my friends. We were walking back to school from lunch, and a group of teenagers from the high school, I was in middle school, high schoolers came down. They asked for money. I said no. And then they went walking, calling me the N-word, and I didn't know what to do. I was very scared. The group of white friends I was with said, don't do anything about it. Someone said that my sister probably knows them. I want to be popular in high school. I can't rat on them. So like those little things kind of pushed me into a box where I didn't have Like I didn't have anyone to go to. I was the only Black girl in my school. And after that, repeated events involving race happened. So that's when I wanted to at least do something and speak on that with my assemblies.
Thank you, Audney. Thank you, Audney. If anybody else would like to speak to that, if not, um, I have a comment that's coming in from either YouTube or Facebook. I'm not sure yet, but it says we need to re-educate the miseducated, and that's the reason why we're having these forums. Speak positivity within our race and culture, because we're taught to believe that we are limited. I think that's what that's saying. Would anybody like to speak to that?
I think that's so important. So I remember it happened, probably when we moved from, and this is, I'm dating myself, but when I grew up in Brampton, I grew up in a very different Brampton. Brampton was not Black and brown at the time that I grew up. And, but we had lived in a area in Bramble that still had, some sense of racialized diversity. And then we moved to Brampton, where there was a new subdivision, but the new subdivision was being built around a very, 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 very old, predominant white subdivision. And so my sister and I would end up going to the school there and probably be one of maybe just a number of Black kids. And I remember the incident, but saying all of that to say, similar to the comment, I think my mom kind of prepared me for it, and she prior to us going to that school, I think we heard a lot about how awesome we were and how great we were, and we could do anything. And I think that that's really important to speak into your children, because when it happened, it was impactful, when I was called the N-word, and when I called, and it was a bit confusing because I was like, oh, I thought it was so wonderful, right? But I realized that my mom was trying to, enhance my own self-esteem to prepare me for that moment. And so I think it's important to not perpetuate that, and to purposely speak wonderful things into your Black children, to let them have a sense of self, because they will probably encounter it sometime in elementary school, and that's where I encountered it. And it was hard to navigate, but I always remembered some of the messages that my parents gave me to prepare myself for that moment.
So you are saying that it is important for us as parents to educate our children about who they are before the society does that. Before society does,
yeah, and educate them about who they are, and also educate them around the tension that they're going to face. And that was the part that I guess my mother, she told me that I was wonderful and all that stuff. What she didn't tell me was that other people wouldn't think I was wonderful. So she did the first part. And then when they started calling me names, I was like, well, wait, my mom told me I'm awesome. So why don't you like me? So that was the part that, she probably wasn't that great at. So I think it's around telling your kids, like speaking how the equity and awesomeness, and that you could do anything, but also understanding that even though you are that person, other people may not appreciate you the same way, and that you're going to have to, face some oppression as a result of that. I think it's important to start when they're young.
Thank you.
That's very right. But the thing is, what Bob Marley said, you need to emancipate yourself from mental slavery, but none but ourselves can free our mind. It's really hard for people who are mentally enslaved to uplift their children, especially Black women, especially Caribbean Black women, have not been taught how to do their real hair, have only been subjected to chemical relaxers and succumbing to white Eurocentric beauty standards. So we would, in a perfect world, if we didn't have 400 years of oppression on us, it would be great to educate or to educate our children young. And we should be doing that when we educate ourselves. And it does start from home. But people need to be more open and more willing to hear other perspectives, to bring to their kids, to tell them that the world will hate you and the world will beat you up and put bruises on you. But you need to come to a consensus of who you are, what your history is, and what your future will be as a community.
I love that, Audney. I think, MLK speaks to um, pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps. But it's hard to do that if you've been subjected to oppression for 400 years. You were speaking to that. I think, Fiona, you had something, and then Ray.
Yeah. And to add to that, and because I work in mental health, I think it's very essential as well for especially the youth. So during the adolescence period, that is a heightened stage of development for them. They're very much consciously aware of themselves. And during that period of time, they can internalize messages about their race. And we know that there are a lot of negative messages of what Blackness means. So by and educating them, socializing them with racial pride, letting them know that society may see you as such, but as a Black community, this is how we see you. And giving them positive message can help them develop a very strong self-esteem that could help protect against racial stress and also mental health problems. So I think it's very ideal that parents do that socialization, because we already know that in the school system, they experience a unique form of oppression or racism, which is known as anti-Black racism. And the school does not basically socialize Black youth or Black children to take pride in who they are, because most, as we know, the curriculum is very much Eurocentric and it has very little Black content. And as a family, as a community, the church community, we have to build a strong identity in our youth. We have to help them develop that positive sense of self, so that they know who they are when they go out in the community and to face all the racism that they may encounter. So I think that is very important, that as a family, as a community, we build strong racial identity in our youth.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Ray.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with what everyone else is saying. I do think you hear that the African proverb that it takes a village, and so I think what Audney mentioned in terms of sometimes our parents, sometimes they just didn't know, and so you can't be mad at people for not knowing what they didn't know. But the point is, moving forward, for us to be able to, within our own communities, to help out, to look at each other, the next generation, to talk to your friends who have children, speak to those children directly. Even through our at church, we have to speak to those who are coming up and let them know this is not stuff that you need to tolerate. My parents were similar to the Derricks. My mother was not one that told us, she wasn't pro-Black specifically. She wasn't walking around the house with a fist up. But she definitely told us, she was like, no one is smarter than you, and you are not better than you are not better than anyone else, and no one is better than you. Not to take any foolishness for anyone. My mother was not the parent that did not missed teacher parent interviews. She would come in and would ask questions, and you need to explain to me what is going on. Ray wasn't listening. Why was I not called? Like, she was very active, and so she was good to call out our teachers as well. She would defend us, sometimes not as much as I would like. But she, would address them and be like, no, this is not right. This needs to happen. I remember an experience with my brother. Ian was very smart. There was just some things that just come very naturally to Ian from when he was a child. And I remember he was the school that we went to for middle school and for high school. It went from 7th grade all the way up to OAC, or grade 13. And so when he was in the 8th grade, I don't know, I think one of his teachers was like, yeah, it's a waste of time for Ian to be in these math classes. Ian should be doing 9th grade math. We can work it out for him to do this a year early. And so when it came time and that's the thing, don't ever tell my mother anything about us, anything good, because she will run with that. So she went to the guidance counselors and she was like, well, my son needs to be, and they discouraged that to happen, and she fought for it. And a lot of parents don't always know that you have that right and that ability to come in and be advocates for your children and to fight for them. It's a lot of times, parents are like, oh, well, just do what the teacher says, just abide by what they're telling you. And there is some truth to that. There is truth to the idea that your teachers already have their education. You're not going to like everyone who's in authority, above you. So just get in there, do your work, and come out. There is truth to that. But there also is, the truth that parents, they can come in and advocate and be like, no, this is not right. And so I'll say all that to say, she went and demanded that the guidance counselors, who and they worked out his schedule, so he was taking 9th grade classes at the 8th grade level. So stuff like that. Like, we need to be able to fight for our children, and push them to go forward, because the sky is really the limit to what they can do.
I agree, and I just wanted to say, and I'll say something controversial because that's my nature. But yeah, I mean, I honestly, because a lot of people say, and of course, people will say, well, Ray and myself came from privilege because we had both of our parents at home, because my mother was at every single parent teacher interview. That school knew Ivy Quashie very well. And I know that a lot of people will say, well, I'm a single parent, I work 4 jobs. I will say this, and I'll say it quite confidently, and anybody could call me afterwards. Do not have children if you are unable to be involved and to check the education system in which you're putting your children in. Okay? Period, end of story. Do not allow your Black children to be educated and raised by these schools without any scrutiny or any checks and balances coming from you, right? And you have to figure it out. If you're working 4 jobs and nothing is more important than this child. You cannot leave your Black children to the current academic system and leave it unchecked and leave it unchallenged and think that they're going to turn out okay. So it is a matter of, if you are working those 4 jobs, hopefully during one of those jobs, you're able to call the school and have a telephone conversation with them, or you're able to take a day off, because, the nonsense and the levels of courses and what they were saying about my sister and myself to us, if my mother was not all over these people, I don't know what self-esteem or where I would be today for some of the things. Some of the teachers telling her that I was, I had a lack of ability to analyze. I was not, I would not fit into society properly because I'm too outspoken. This is like the nonsense that they would come and tell me. And for me to go back home and tell my mom that, and my mom to say something like, well, I can't go back and check the teacher because I'm too busy with these 4 jobs, would be absolutely ludicrous, right? So they weren't able to get away with a lot of that stuff because of how involved my mom was in my schooling. So I just encourage you, and I know it's harder if you're a single parent, but do not let the school systems raise your kids without any accountability on your part. Find a way to do it. I'm serious. If that means taking a day off of work, if that means having a friend check in on the school on your behalf, something. Don't leave it up to the school on its own.
Thank you
adding
so
on
much.
to that.
Go right ahead, Audney.
Oh, sorry. What I've seen for the past couple of years is that, especially in high school, a lot of these guidance counselors, more specifically in the Peel District School Board and Upper Grand District School Board and wherever else, they subject Black boys to applied and like workplace level courses. Not saying that is wrong, but they have the capability, most of these boys have the capability to pursue academic courses or not just trades. And it's so present that they don't believe that Black boys should be in academic, they think that, and the constant stereotype of the strong Black women or strong Black boy, that is present in the medical field and in the education system, that they're too strong and they don't need help. But at the end of the day, if they're struggling, if they're getting a 50, if they're failing an academic class, I bet you, why don't you get a tutor? Why are there not more programs in these schools to help and uplift these Black youth that may not have a stable home life, that may be struggling with mental health issues that no one can actually analyze right now. And so I really, 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 what's the word I'm looking for? I'm really sick and tired, actually, of seeing these Black boys just be subjected to only applied. And again, what I said about the Peel school counselor or whatever, I forget what his position was, but it was in a meeting. He called kids, 6th graders and 8th graders, criminals. And yes, it is a common name that most people use to identify the school or identify students from that school. Yet coming from a white man, you think that these Black boys and these Black girls are criminals. So what's happening in the school system?
Thank you so much, Audney. I really like where you and Derek were going about the school system. I'm just going to take a comment from YouTube. Someone says, in my opinion, we need to dispel the myth that Canadian society is too polite to be racist. There's a whole lot of microaggressions and overt racism right here in this, quote, polite society. I heard once that Canada is racism with a smile. There's another comment which says, yes, your positive affirmations are good for your children. Another one says, a lot of teachers were covertly racist. This is speaking on the education system. I ended up in the office for resisting a few times in high school, and the anti-Black racism has been exposed by research recently, especially in Peel. One more from YouTube. This one says, we also need to rid ourselves, that is speaking to our community, of the Eurocentric images in our churches. It's galling sometimes to see them presented during sermons as representation of historical facts. That is so true. We'll get to that a little later in our discussion as we deal with the role of the church. But I'd like to re-emphasize what Derek and Audney were saying about the responsibility we have to ourselves as a community to speak life and positivity into our youth. Nobody else will do it for us, so we've got to do it for ourselves.
And Pastor, I just want to reiterate, I mean, I forgot to mention, there was that 11th grade teacher, 12th grade teacher who was saying to me, and it was English, and I was always doing well in English, and all of a sudden I was getting C's and D's because I lacked the ability to analyze, is what he said. I wasn't able to put two thoughts together and come up with an analysis, apparently, despite the fact that I was doing well all the time. But my mom, who didn't tell me that she went to the school to fix that teacher's wagon, and she fixed his wagon indeed. And all of a sudden I started building a better relationship with this teacher. Years later, we found out that he was very much involved with the Hells Angels and and had links to the KKK, right? There was evidence of that. Years later, we found out from another group of teachers, maybe about 10 or 12 years later. So saying all of that to say, can you imagine, you don't know who's teaching your children. You don't know the mindset of the people who are teaching your children, right? Do not let the system go unchecked without your accountability if your child is in it.
Yeah, and I'm just going back to one of the comments that said they've heard about racism in Canada just being put on with a smile. I don't know. But I'm going to answer that with saying, why are we listening to white men in power saying that there's no anti-Black racism or any sort of systemic racism? If we look at the residential schools, if we look at everything the Canadian government has done in the past 50 plus years concerning the Chinese railway, Caribbean maids, and so on. I can talk days about this subject, but as Black people, I know there are people who are saying, oh, there isn't any systemic racism because I don't go through that. Okay, open your eyes, look at different perspectives. It is there. Indigenous groups in Canada face mass incarceration at rates that Black people are facing in America. So when we're looking at these things, there is anti-Black and anti-Indigenous and anti-BIPOC a racism present, and is very, like we're talking about right now, it's very present in the education system.
I think to the person's point, and Pastor and Ray, and you know, I don't know, Fiona, if you've lived in the States, like I think that, you know, for those of us, at least I'll speak on I'll share my opinion, but you know, Ray, Pastor, I'm assuming that maybe you have the same opinion. I thought it was easier to navigate race in the U.S. I thought it was easier to navigate racism in the U.S. because at least they believe that they have it. So you're now like, you're just in the US, you're like, okay, you don't like me, I don't like, you know, you don't like me, so let's have a conversation, right? I think here it's a challenge because you're actually having the first part of the conversation is proving that it exists. So you're actually trying to convince people that yes, racism exists in Canada before you even get to the impact, because they do want to kind of pretend that it's not here. And so I found it easier to navigate issues in the States where they do not even try to pretend it's not there. Whereas in Canada, I find it very implicit and harder to navigate because we pretend that it doesn't exist. I don't know, Ray, if you had the same perspective.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I mentioned earlier, I'm a talent manager. One of my clients is the Howard University Gospel Choir. And we do a lot of international touring where we go to different countries, where we partner with the State Department, the US State Department, and we'll put on cultural diplomacy programming. Usually they have us come for Black History Month, and we use gospel music to talk about the story of enslaved Africans coming to the US, and then going through that entire process, and the way that that music has sort of been the soundtrack to that experience. And through the horrible experience of the transatlantic slave trade, how, you know, the music and the art that has come forward is actually incredibly beautiful. And it's always interesting, you know, the people who work at the US embassies in these other countries, when they're talking to the people of whatever country we're visiting, they're introducing us, they'll say, yes, you know, the group has come to talk about, you know, how, you know, what slavery did and this, and they'll talk about it openly, like you're talking about, you know, going to the store to buy food, and it's very matter of fact. And it's interesting how they're sort of forced to do that because, you know, there's 400 years of this behavior that has sort of gone on, and they you know, like Derek said, they have to address it. Whereas here, I think we're a little different in that we have a lot of us, our parents came. So we're like first or second generation Canadians. So we don't have that long standing history with Canada, with the country of Canada. And so I think for some people who are Canadian, they think that, you know, oh, well, you know, we allowed people to come here. You know, you immigrated here. You chose to get a visa to come here and work and have kids. So it can't be that terrible. And it's like, no, that's far from the truth. And like everyone else has been saying, that it's just embedded in the system, sometimes to the point that if you don't even realize it, you might not even catch it. So as Audny was saying, you have a lot of kids in these different schools, you know, Black boys and girls who are put on a track to go into different subjects or follow different curriculums that may not necessarily be the best options for them. And I'm not downplaying, you know, studying a trade or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that what they will do is they will channel some of our kids to take classes or to operate at a different level. And a lot of times, as Derek said, if your parents don't know, they go in and they have the right to be able to speak and advocate for their children, you know, the parents will be like, oh, okay, well, I guess, you know, little Johnny only can operate at a basic level or at a general level. And then he ends up sort of getting into a system. And then once you graduate high school, I don't know how things are now, but if you graduate high school with that different certification and you aren't geared to be able to like find proper work and to be able to succeed in different areas, like you're stuck.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is, Canada, I think it is, it is racism with a smile here, because we are, in general, Canadians are very polite. And so you do have to, again, we as a community have to like empower each other, empower our children, and work together to fight against the systems that be.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ray. Fiona, you work particularly with youth, with Black youth. Would you like to speak to empowering youth, especially within the Black community?
Sure. I think working with Black youth in the area of mental health, what I see a lot happening is like a lot of those Black youth that I have worked with, they enter counseling services through the court system. They are court mandated, and we know that young Black male are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So sometimes when I encounter those youth, they don't want to be in counseling because they're forced to be there. And sometimes the stories that they would tell as a Black person is like, it hurts. It breaks my heart because sometimes they're in the court system for something that, for example, a white person will not even get arrested for. So when they come to me, my role is to help empower them and to let them see that there are so much good in them and they should not see themselves from a place of deficit, but try to empower themselves. And sometimes if they speak about like God and the relationship with God, I will go right there with them. And I will tell them what God thinks about them and let them know that they are special, they are uniquely made, and that they should surround themselves with positivity. Because when they come to me, sometimes they internalize those messages that they would never get a job. I have a criminal record. I would never get a job. I will be rejected in society. And we don't want our young youth to grow up feeling that way. And I think like all the systems, they work together to perpetuate systemic racism against the Black youth and Black people in general, creating what I would call is like a systemic scar. So it's like, how would we get rid of that scar for that young person? And the system, to be honest, does not respond in a way, in most cases, that is positive. And for me, I view the response of the system as a hit and run. They do not take responsibility. Most of the many times, the systems do not take responsibility for their action. And the responsibility is placed on the individual and the community to deal with the problem. So as Black people, having a lot of role model, having a lot of mentorship for the young Black male, I think it's one of the ways of helping them see themselves in a different light and to know that they are valued. They are valued in the Black community. They are valued in the community and in their family. And sometimes they don't feel that. So having like external support for Black youth, both male and female, to let them know that they mean something, that they are valued and we believe in them. I think just that alone, sending that positive message, and I do it as much as I can, is one of the ways of uplifting young persons. And I will tell you that experience I have with that young person. He came to me for counseling. And while going through counseling, that young person told me a story. And by the time I continued to empower that young person, I was like, what are you here for? He said, everything you said to me, that's what I came here for. And it saddened my heart knowing that he has to come to a place of counseling to hear somebody pour into his spirit, to empower him, to let him know that his life matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we need. We need a community around our young boys and girls to help them build them and let them know that they are not limited and they should move away from the confines of what society say that they are.
Mhm. We're actually getting comments coming in for you, but thank you so much for that. I think it was very telling for you to share that they are mandated. So their route to therapy, to therapeutic care, is all messed up because they are getting to the criminal justice system, then to therapy, which means it should really be avoiding the criminal system by going through. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But how can we address the stigma within our community that surrounds mental health?
And you know what? Because we know that within the Caribbean community, stigma is a big issue. And right now, I'm at a place where in my research where I'm trying to figure out what the young people feel, experience. Is it really the stigma of mental illness or the racism of mental illness?
Wow. Wow.
And how they come together to inform. Because, like, for example, in the Black community, we talk a lot about stigma, but stigma compounds the experience with racism. So when we think about stigma, we're talking about the stigma of mental illness, the names that we use, like somebody maybe we use the N word, nut, or crazy. Those are the words that perpetuate the stigma. And the stigma of mental illness is it's really hard for parents to accept because sometimes, especially in the Black community, Black bodies in general are imagined as the host of mental illness.
Wow.
And just imagine having a mental illness that can derail somebody's life. So parents do not want their children to be the word mental illness by itself is a really hard word for a lot of parents. Even when I'm doing presentation in the community, sometimes instead of saying mental illness, I have to say mental wellness or mental well-being because they do not accept the word mental illness because of that stigma and what the stigma brings about shame. Sometimes it project blame on the parents that, oh, it's something that I do, there is some flaw in my parenting that has caused my child to experience they have that mental health experience. So stigma is a big thing, but again, when it comes to stigma, I am in between. It is stigma of mental illness or the racism of mental illness, but stigma is a real issue and it can prevent people from actually seeking help to treat a mental illness.
Thank you, thank you. And one more real quick question to you. Can you discuss, or maybe we could cover this later, but can you discuss any coping strategies that we may be beneficial in the face of experiences of racism?
Well, you know what? Racism can cause psychological stress. It causes psychological stress and can cause mental illness. So to cope with racism, because racism is basically is the destruction of a Black person's dignity and worth. So telling the person that they are special, they are unique, but fighting racism alone is not an easy task because it is deeply embedded within the structure of society. But some of the ways of coping from racism, especially with children, providing them a platform, youth, a platform where they can tell their story because silence, a culture of silence does not help people cope with what they're going through. And racism is a big issue in the life of young people and the Black community as a whole. So for example, the church, the Black community, the family, just providing that space where kids can come and talk without the fear of being judged and being listened to so that they can get whatever feelings that they have inside to be addressed. Because if the feelings stay inside, it can manifest into other things. For example, anger, frustration, behavioral issue. So coping with racism, it's not an easy task, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort for parents to educate their children on race. And for the system, it has to take a lot of work from the system as load. So like putting in the, I mean, it's hard that we put a lot of times we put the responsibility on the individuals and the family, but the system has to take a lot of responsibility and reforming a lot of policies and practices to help people cope. Because as long as racism exists, we will continue to have a lot of issues, and coping and healing is going to be like a daunting task.
Thank you, Fiona.
You're
We are
welcome.
actually going to transition into the latter topics for discussion. And this has more to do with social justice, activism, and the church, our role as Christians, and the role of the church. So the traditionally Seventh Day Adventists have not necessarily been very overt, very expressive in dealing with these issues. I throw this question out to you all, to the entire panel. Do you think the church has been complicit? If so, why? Do we as a church community perpetuate the ills of the society as relates to race?
Yes. Yes, 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 yes. First of
Yes.
all, I've never been to
Yes.
a white church in my life. I've only ever been to predominantly white churches, predominantly Black churches. And that is right there, that's segregation. What else can we say? There's so much anti-Black racism. I've never experienced anti-Black racism in the Adventist Church in Ontario, because I have not been to many other churches, but there it is there. Why, as Adventists, why should we not speak up about race issues when, as Christians, first of all, Christianity was used to oppress Black people in a sense, and we used our spirituality and our religion to uplift our community coming out of slavery. So it's like, why do we have to be silent to be godly? I don't understand that.
So I think
I
that,
think.
oh, go ahead, Derek. Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think that, I think in our Black churches, if we're not able to even figure out and address our Eurocentric beliefs around worship, I have low expectations around us being able to understand the issues of social justice, because I think our heads are still in the sand around how we even worship, and the Eurocentric ideologies that have been kind of infiltrating our Black churches. So you don't need to, Audney, go to a white church to see the impact of racism. You could be right in Mississauga Seventh-day Adventist Church.
They're still
and
mad at me for wearing
I will
pants.
point out various aspects in our worship service that have clearly infiltrated our African heritage as being acceptable worship, right? And so if we're not even able to address that elephant in the room, I think we're challenged around our understanding of social justice. But absolutely, I think the answer is yes. We're completely complicit. You started very, very eloquently out of Amos, where Amos says explicitly, you cannot have godliness without justice and righteousness. It's a contradiction. It's a contradiction is what he's saying. It just becomes a form of godliness without substance. And you cannot have godliness without fighting for righteousness. And righteousness is not just the spiritual righteousness. Righteousness is also right, social rightness and social justice. You can't have any conflict there. And I think that we're timid around those things, because I think the white man has created us to be a timid kind of culture as it pertains to worship in church.
To be compliant, huh, Derek?
Yes, absolutely.
So there's a comment coming in. I think it's in response to Audney, from one of our elders at church. He says, I visited a church in a particular city, and it was communion. The white brother that washed my feet during the foot washing ceremony never touched my feet. I had never experienced that before.
Is his feet smelly? I'm kidding.
Your feet weren't smelly, or dear brother. But of course, I think what Derek is saying, what Audney is saying, is that we need to actually turn the microscope on ourselves, turn the magnifying glass on ourselves to analyze, assess how we are understanding what worship ought to be, how we are thwarting our own nature as it relates to worship and our understanding of what true religion is.
Yeah, I think some people would probably say that we probably shouldn't even be having this conversation on the Sabbath, right? Like that is how much the concept of worship and social justice discussions have been completely separated, right? Purposely, because people are like, this is not a Sabbath conversation to have. So I think we need to examine that and kind of ask ourselves why. Because to me, I actually think of the Sabbath and spiritual things in tandem with social justice. I think they're interconnected.
I want to go
I
to
think,
Ray. Oh, Fiona, go ahead.
okay, I was just wanting to say that when it comes to social justice and the church, I think Jesus Christ being the head of the church, his missionary work was all about social justice. When he said that I came basically to liberate the poor, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, like the captive, and to bring sight to the blind. And when people were enslaved, our people were enslaved, the Black churches, that was the only institution that Black people were able to self-govern. And they were involved in social justice, fighting against slavery. And even during the civil rights movement with Dr. Martin Luther King, the church was very active. They were very active in terms of a political agenda fighting against racism. And I think now, in today's age, I think the church probably is more or less sleeping when it comes to issues around racism. That is very important to Black people within the Black churches. So the church again can build not only a strong racial identity, but also a spiritual identity as well. What it does, but you cannot build a strong spiritual identity without addressing some of the issues that are very important to Black people, and that is racism. So that creating that space, having programs for young people and the community where they can come together and share. So I think many churches have to move away from that culture of silence and provide that room, that space, that safe space where people can come, because the church is not only a building, it's a community. It's a community that instills faith, instill hope, and instill that sense of belonging. And sometimes we may not have the outside world, but we have each other, and that can help us to cope with racism. So more dialogue, more conversation like what we have within the church community, I think is needed, and it's very crucial at this point in time where we have like white people becoming more now so consciously aware of how they have been implicit when it comes to racism, and not realizing that, you know what, they have to shift away from that white focus, that white lens, and to really understand the impact of racism by looking at the experience of Black men and Black people in the community. And I think the church is an ideal space to help foster those conversations around race and its effect on Black lives in total.
Thank you, thank you, Ray. Thank you so much, Fiona. I'd like for you to speak to Derek. Touched on worship. You are in music. Can you speak to worship in the Black community, and it's how colonized it may be in our style, in our form?
That's always a very interesting topic, because I don't even think that we understand how deep the problem is with that. Like I don't think we recognize it at all. When I was living in DC, we as a church, we as an Adventist church, we pride ourselves on being different. You know, we're set apart. You know, we are the special ones, the chosen few. You know, we have the right message. All of, you know, that's what we pride ourselves on from a global standpoint. Let me just put that out there. And when I was in DC, I had a part-time job singing on Sunday mornings at an Episcopal church. And it was interesting because we would come in, the choir would come, I would just a tenor sing in the choir. And literally all of the songs, I knew all of them. The director at one point, when I was coming in, he was like, well, you know, are you familiar? I know you come from a different background. Are you familiar with all of this? And all the songs they would sing, I was like, these are all songs that
Just to be clear, this is a white church.
No, this is a Black church. This is the Black church in Washington, D.C. Okay. And so a lot of I can't even think of names of them. A lot of these like very like old hymns that they would sing and stuff that I knew that we would sing at church, the church choir would sing growing up. And I would laugh to myself because I was like, you know, first of all, we sit over here thinking that, you know, we're so separate and whatever. It's like, no, we're doing the same stuff. You know, we've taken the same stuff from, you know, these European cathedrals from years gone back. Like, this is all that we have, you know, we've put into our services, and we've chosen to, that's not fair for me to say we've chosen. We've been forced to believe this for so long that some of us actually believe this, that that in order for us to be reverent, a service has, you know, for us to worship and to be reverent, we have to be silent. We have to be quiet. And it's like, yeah, that's not, you know, that's just not true. That isn't true at all. And it was interesting. It was only when I went to when you start to visit other churches, when I was living in the States for a while, and you're exposed to different worship styles, and it's like, this feels more normal. This feels like I'm enjoying this. I'm participating in this. And I do want to be clear. I don't think that there is necessarily one specific way to worship God. And I think that is, in a way, that I think is beautiful about the Adventist Church is that we do have different options. Variety is a better word than saying options. We do have a variety. I think what the challenge becomes when we look at one as right and as one as being wrong. And it's you know, a lot of this is just preference. Because at the end of the day, when we all get to heaven, we're going to be up there like, I can't believe we were singing like this. I can't believe we were doing this. We're so much more. And we will all be saying that. From the man who loves the classical music, to the woman who loves her heavy gospel, to the other person who loves their country gospel, and the other man with his harmonica. All of us are going to be like, the stuff we'd had down here was foolishness compared to what we're going to be experiencing up there. So I think we do have to be open to we need to be open to, you know, people are expressing themselves through worship in different ways. Even at our church, I struggle with this, but I don't know if I feel like we are capturing. I don't know if we tailor our music to meet everyone's needs, and I'm not talking about like my mother, who is like, you know, super conservative woman, to me who likes gospel. I'm talking about there's a group of youth at our church, and I wonder if we're missing them in terms of what we do with our music. I personally am not, you know, I'm not a fan of gospel hip hop. I'm just gonna put that out there. I'm not. I don't want to hear it. But you know, I also recognize I don't have the right to, you know, I don't have the right to have the autonomy over what, you know, what can potentially lead other people to Christ. And so I think that we do need to be open to the fact that there are some of our younger youth who may not necessarily be interested in, you know, or may not necessarily let me use my words. We need to be open to the fact that some of our younger youth may not necessarily be able to receive the message through a hymn that's 300 years old. They might not necessarily be able to receive the message through, you know, a gospel song that I might love from the 90s, but they might be gravitating more towards someone who speaks in the language that they speak. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, a lot of people say, you know, we shouldn't be mixing secular with religious, and, you know, they're two separate things. And it's like, you know, a lot of these hymns are literally just, they took, you know, classical songs or from the Baroque period or from wherever. I know, Pastor, you can, you know, speak to this a little bit better than I can. They took those hymns, which were the secular songs of the day, and they attached religious lyrics to them. So some of these songs that we sing all four stanzas. We sing all four of these hymns, and you can step outside of religious circles and go into the classical world, and people are like, oh yeah, that's, you know, Mozart's, you know, Concerto number 16, or that's, you know, Schubert's this or whatever. And it's like, yeah, that some of these tunes were not written, you know, specifically because they wanted to worship God. This was their job, and so they wrote these songs, and we brought them into the church. Yeah. So I think our understanding of what is secular versus what is religious, that all we need to look at that, and just be open to, you know, different worship styles, because we're not a monolith. And I think it's wrong the way that we as a church sometimes attack that, where we look at, you know, what is white is right, and music that other people might like. Oh, well, you can beat your drum in AY, you know, we'll just do it there, because, you know, divine service is
they don't even allow us to do it there anyways.
Holy part. Like, you know,
but can I just add on to
just 1 minute before you jump in, Audney? There's a comment I'd like to highlight right here. It says, we need to relinquish the vestiges of colonialism in our African and Caribbean community. Go right ahead, Audney.
Oh, just adding on to Ray's point and that point, I feel like before we even allow, well, let me fix my wording. Um, I don't think the church is even ready to, especially Mississauga, to explore different worship styles when we're still calling our young men criminals, and when we still don't even want to mentor our teenage boys right now. And you know who you are. Anybody who's watching this, how are we supposed to we don't give them any freedom in their ways to express how they want to worship. There we have boys in our church, teenage boys, who are so talented, so gifted in many different criteria, not just at with the piano or anything. They are very, very smart people, but we have put them in a box and said that they were criminals and we don't want to associate with them. And that goes on to colonial
we being society, right? Or is that what you're saying? Or we
society
being
in
the church?
Mississauga Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay.
And that
I'm not aware of us labeling our youth as criminals. That's what I
never
was
knew
just
that.
asking. No,
I've heard that so
no.
many times that some people, some of them feel uncomfortable because people have just said that they're criminals or that they're not safe. It's stuff like that, like really harsh words towards.
That's their that's a perceptions there.
Yeah, when it comes to anybody a boy wearing braids, or maybe he's not wearing a church a shirt, etc. Those types of things. Anyways, that does correlate back to our not our worship styles, colonialism in African and Caribbean households, because it stems from the house. So yeah, that's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Audney. So we are winding down, but quickly as we wind down, I'd like to speak to, of course, in relevance to the season, protest, and as we speak on social justice, people think that race, social justice sometimes is a political issue, and that the church should not be involved in politics. Would anyone like to respond to that?
I don't want to talk too much, but politics and our laws are centered around religion. So that point is completely redundant.
So you are saying, could you explain that, Audney?
Our laws and the Ten Commandments, church and religion have been integrated for centuries. So why do you want to remove yourself now? That's just being consciously ignorant.
So you are saying we are not as removed from society as we think we are.
Especially as Christians, we are the superior religion right now in North American society. Why are you going to remove yourself because you feel uncomfortable talking about politics?
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna take a comment that's coming from one of our elders as well. Are you guys hearing me clearly?
Yes.
All right, so it says that now that the curtain has been pulled back, we need Blacks for Blacks support programs to give our children an upper hand, similar to what other races do with their children. Nurturing and guidance for us, by us. I don't know if you remember FUBU. For us, by us. We need to reintegrate that into our mindset as a Black community. It goes on to say there's so much shame in our Christian culture when we promote Black History Month because it's not inclusive of other races. This needs to stop. We are perpetuating our own shame. So I think this person is saying that we need to be Black and proud. By shining light on our issues, we are not dimming those issues of other ethnic groups. Ray?
Yeah, I just started to jump in. That gets on my nerves. When it's February and it's time to celebrate Black History Month and we try to turn it into, let's have a cultural moment. That's no. Like if your birthday is on Tuesday and I bring a cake, with my name on it to your birthday party, like, that's problematic. That is problematic. Okay. So like, if you want to, it's better to just not celebrate anyone at all. Okay. But February, like it's when we're celebrating Black History Month, that's completely separate. But yeah, I definitely agree that we need to do better as a community. Like, we need to do better and work towards to build each other up, especially through church. I as a child growing up, church was one of the few places where I could be like Black. Like we were allowed to be around, you know, like we had our Black friends. You know, that's literally, you know, school was kind of sort of, you know, when it was convenient, you could do that. But at church, that is when we were allowed to, you know, interact. You know, you learn so much through Pathfinders, through AY skills that I learned in those spaces, like I use to this day, like to this day. And I think we need to do better with building each other up, especially through church. And Audney touched on some stuff that's very, very important. A lot of these youth, I remember I really noticed this when I used to direct the youth choir, like late 90s, early 2000s. And we had members in the youth choir, like kids would come, like the members of the church, youth from the church would invite their friends, like who were not Adventists, who were not even Christian for real. They just like to sing, and they would invite them to come. And so like we would like have like a population of the choir that, you know, this was the way that we were introducing them to who we were. And you know, when there would be issues where people would be like, oh, we don't like this song, or oh, you know, the children, they must sing too loud and they're clapping, all of that. And it's like, no, you're missing it. Like, this is a ministry. This is a ministry. We need to think about some of these things. You know, yeah, maybe you don't like that song that we sang. Guess what? I don't like when the person sings the country gospel, but I definitely recognize that, you know, people can see Christ through those moments, and it's not all about me. Mm-hmm. And so I think we as a church need to just model Jesus's example. Jesus is very like, you know, he went up against the authorities. He said what he had to do. And there were times when he had to overturn a table. And he was crucified for it. He was crucified for it. But I think we need to be intentional in moving ourselves forward as Christians, as Black Christians, as Black Adventists. We need to do a better job all around.
Yeah. So I just looked up like the definition for politics, and it's like the activities associated with the governance of a country or area, especially the debate or conflict among individuals or parties having or hoping to achieve power, the activities of governments concerning the political relations between countries, the academic study of government and the state. You listen to those definitions. Jesus was the biggest politician there was, right? So why would think about evangelism, think about the mission of the church, and then ask yourself, why wouldn't the church want to be associated with activities that govern a country or an area? Does that make sense to you? If we have the message, if we have truth, would that truth not want to influence policy and the governance of a country? Right? So, I mean, think about, you know, I think we have a lot of history, you know, kind of like history, you know, we have history of ignorance where it's just like, oh, you know, my mother told me we weren't supposed to be involved in politics, or my grandmother told me we weren't to be involved in law. Hogwash, foolishness, stupidness. In order to bring the mission of Christ's gospel forward, we need to be engaged in politics. Jesus was the biggest politician ever. And so for the church to think that we are going to be our own little bubble, our own little kind of nucleus, and not engage in governance and policy, we're not going to push the three angels message forward. We will not be successful. We cannot do it without engaging in these conversations.
And to add to that, even what we see happening right now with the killing of George Floyd, we see like Joe Biden, who's a politician. He's going into the Black community, to Black churches, having conversation, because the church and politics. And I said, back in slavery, the church was the only institution that allowed Black people to be Black and to allow them to have that autonomy. And even during the civil rights movement, the church took on a political identity. They wanted the structure to change. And I think the church has more power than they can ever imagine. But for some reason, the Black churches, I don't think that they're using that power enough to effect the changes that can help dismantle racism and to bring that feeling of comfort and safety for Black people in general.
And just to like add on to that point, Donald Trump at the beginning of his what is that thing at his campaign? He went to Black churches to show that solidarity, to a sense. I'm not gonna speak about, anyways. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're all agreeing. Our consensus is that it is our duty, our responsibility to be active as it relates to politics. To be political. Quite contrary from what some people may think, even within our ranks, it is our responsibility to be political, because politics governs our lives. It affects our lives, so we can't separate ourselves from it.
Doesn't it? I'm gonna cut you off. Doesn't it also affect our church? Is there not politics in our church? Do we not have a board? Do we not have things that affect marginalized groups in our church?
Yes, absolutely. So politics affects you whether you like it or not. So we can't separate ourselves from it. We're wrapping up. We have two people that are receiving comments and questions from YouTube and from Facebook from the live stream. I'm gonna take a look at what they have sent in. There's one comment that says, "We need to remember religion and its constraints is man-made. Look at how the religious leaders treated Jesus." And that's all that needs to be said on that. Thank you so much for that comment, whoever it was that shared that. We have another one that says, "Social justice also needs to address the equality of women and women's ordination." That is another topic which I would love to discuss. We'll set that up for another time, but thank you so much for that comment. If we have no more questions coming in, Derek, was that an applause?
Women's ordination, yes.
Yes. Okay, so we'll actually take up that conversation another time. But coming out of this conversation, we'd like to very clearly share that as a church community, we stand with those who are hurting at this time, those who are suffering, and we commit to not only speaking about these issues, but to actively playing a part in making the world a better place by speaking against injustice, standing in opposition to inequity and inequality, and standing on the side of righteousness, raising our voice on behalf of those who are disenfranchised, marginalized, and ostracized. That is the stance which we take as a church community. And we also would like to implement strategies and programs and initiatives to speak up in our political circles to ensure that our voice is heard and that we effect positive change within our community, as is our responsibility to be salt and to be light in the earth. If we have no closing statements, we have no more questions from the stream. Derek, do you have anything to say? Ray, Audney, Fiona, go ahead, please.
I would just like to say, for the Black community, don't be consciously ignorant. Yeah.
Can you explain that just a little further?
I feel like it's self-explanatory. Don't choose to be ignorant. Research, read a book. There are lots of books, actually. Read a book. It's pretty great.
Thank you, Audney.
Yeah, I would just say that, hopefully we, these conversations move the dial on our activity around social justice as a church, right? If we're saying to our, white counterparts that silence is not an option, how dare silence to be an option for the church, right? Like we're a structured, organized religion. So we should have expectations, right, around a structured, organized religion, and and not being silent. So I would just encourage all of us at our local churches to really examine our footprint and how active we are around social justice and what we can do to move the dial in our own local areas.
Thank you, Derek. Ray?
And definitely, I think as a church, I think we have to, because I think we have to understand that as members of a church, as a part of this community, we have rights, and we do have a say in what goes on. I think it's probably, you mentioned earlier about racism and the church being complicit. It's if we want to be honest, it's problematic that you look at the Adventist Church on a global scale, and you look at our leadership, and it's like, wait a minute, these things don't look like each other. Like they don't. And that needs to both, from a cultural standpoint, in terms of representation from men and women, these are things that we need to that need to be changed from the top down. And yet, we talk about our churches being segregated. I don't know, that word kind of bothers me. And the only reason why it bothers me is because I think a lot of times, especially in the States, we look at, Black churches, and we sort of decide, okay, well, the Black people, they went and they did, they should dismantle that and come over and join. And, we're not honest. Like, even if you look at a lot of these churches here, even in Toronto, we think in 2020, these West Indian churches have always been that way. It's like, no. Some of these had very different, the demographics were a little bit different, maybe in the 50s and 60s, when the immigration laws changed and a lot of people immigrated and came. And it's like, wait a minute, that family from Jamaica is coming here now? Wait, that Bayesian family is here now? Oh, we'll worship in the suburbs. We'll head elsewhere, and that is why, let's be honest, that's why a lot of these churches that are filled with these West Indian people here in Toronto, in the GTA, the reasons why they look at that now is because of white flight. And I'm not knocking anyone or telling anyone, yes, you have the right to worship where you want, but let's just be very clear, why a lot of this stuff has been set up the way that it's sort of been set up. A lot of people are saying the regional conferences, which are the Black conferences in the US, they need to dismantle. And it's like, do they? Because no one is saying, and I know we're trying to wrap up, no one is saying that the other conferences should dismantle and join the regional conferences. No one's saying that. Everyone's saying that the regional conferences need to dismantle themselves and join the white one. And that's, are you going to address the needs of everyone? Is everyone going to be represented? Are we really going to, fund Oakwood the same way we fund Andrews? Like, are we really going to do all of this? Are we? So let's, if we're going to do the work, let's be real about it. Let's speak up. And I mean, at the end of the day, we as Christians are here to just love on people and to share the good news of Jesus Christ. That's what we're here to do. Sometimes it's comfortable, sometimes it's not. But everything Jesus did was not comfortable. It just wasn't. So,
Thank you so much, Ray. Thank you. And Fiona.
Yes, so what I would like to say, we as a Black people, we survived slavery. We are very resilient. We survived slavery, we survived Jim Crow, and we're surviving systemic racism, even though that we have lost a lot of lives. But right now is a time that we cannot be silent. We have to use our voice from the grassroots to impact changes within the structures, within the system. We need changes we need reform in the criminal justice system, child welfare, mental health, the educational system, because these are all the systems that are out there to promote well-being and to enhance a personal outlook in life. But yet, Black people, as I said before, we experience a unique type of racism, which is called anti-Black racism. And I think that the church is in a very good position right now to help we as a Black community instill hope, instill faith and trust in our members who may feel further marginalized based on the experience in society. So I think together as a community, the church has a very important role to play, and especially the youth, the young men. Reach out to them, bring them in, let them know that there is a community within the church that is willing and ready to accept them just the way they are. Because you know what? At the end of the day, we are Black, not only 1 month a year, but we are constantly Black. That is permanent. It's not going to change.
Thank you so much, Fiona. As we close, we want to thank everyone who tuned in. As you are protesting, as you are being active against systemic racism and injustice, at this time, we encourage you to stay safe and continue to keep faith and trust in Jesus to cover us, to keep us safe during this time. I'd like to share this with you. If you are protesting, don't stop, because it is actually making change. Since protesting has started, just in the season of George Floyd, we've actually seen changes in public policies. We've seen police departments defunded and funds directed in other ways that can uplift communities so they don't have to be incarcerated. We've seen Walmart stop selling guns and stop locking up Black hair products. We've seen physicians condemn racism. We've seen companies paid holidays on Juneteenth, June 19th. And we've seen leaders resign after complaints of racist company culture. We're seeing this large scale change in system, but we must not stop. We must continue to fight this cause during this season. We believe that there is one race. This race is the human race. Racism is a human construct, and God sees us all equal at the foot of the cross. We are all one people with red blood flowing through our veins. So we would like to dispel and disbark, to tear down all the barriers which separate us as people of God. We thank you so much for tuning in. May God bless you and keep you. Let us pray. Dear God, we thank you for the ability we have to join in this conversation. We pray that these conversations may sow seeds, inspire people to shine light in their sphere of influence, to be salt within their small circles so that we can make the world a better place. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you all. And
God bless you.
thank you so much to our panel, Fiona, Audney, Ray, and Derek.